An everyday adventure. Emma slipped her chubby little hands into the pockets of her hot pink jacket. Winters in the foothills of South Carolina could get surprisingly cold. Leaves crunched under her feet as she made her way through the small patch of woods behind her grandmother's Pickens County home. She looked up at the tall pine trees towering over her and began to wonder whether or not she would be able to climb one. How hard can it be? She thought aloud. Of course I can climb a tree. After spending several minutes trying to find the perfect tree, she started her ascent. She reached up to the lowest branch and tried to pull herself up. Climbing a tree was harder than she thought. She struggled to get her feet off the ground and eventually just gave up. Who likes climbing trees anyway? She brushed her hands off and was off to her next adventure. Soon, Emma found herself at the edge of a ravine. It was fairly shallow, but still deep enough that the 7-year-old couldn't jump down without risking a broken ankle. She walked along the ravine's edge until she made it to a point where she could safely climb in. She slowly made her way down the naturally formed ramp and began to explore her newfound territory. As she walked along, something caught the child's eye. It was a hole in the side of the ravine, a large one. Emma was fascinated with her discovery. It reminded her of the bear cave she had seen in picture books. She just stood there for a moment in a daydream-like state, wondering what creature called this hole home. Then, suddenly, she realized how much she didn't want to come face to face with a bear or whatever else would come out of that small cave. Full of childish fear, she dashed off, up and out of the ravine. Of course, there was nothing really there, and the hole was no more than a few feet deep. But in that moment, Emma's imagination got the best of her, and like many children, fear of the imagined was just as great as the fear of anything real. A cold wind blew through the trees and across the back of her neck. She shivered and pulled her jacket tight around her. Emma had no idea how long she'd been out there, nor did she know where she was. With little sense of time and space to begin with, the girl got easily turned around after climbing out of the ravine. Cold and lost, she began to panic. All she wanted was to be back in her grandmother's house, sitting in front of the fire, snacking on some fresh-baked cookies. She figured that if she just ran, she would come out of the woods eventually, so she took off. The chilly air stung the back of her throat, and her nose grew red and runny. Slipping on some leaves, Emma fell to the ground with a loud whap. She just sat there in a state of shock for a second, before bursting into a flood of tears. She pulled her mud-stained knees up against her chest and rocked back and forth, violently sobbing. Although it was hard to hear over the sound of her own cries, she could make out the faint sound of her grandmother's voice calling for her. "Gammy?" She wiped her eyes and pulled herself to her feet. She heard the familiar voice call out her name once more. She began to run again, this time careful not to slip on wet leaves or trip over a stray root. The sun shone through the trees brightly as she reached the edge of the woods. As she emerged, she realized where she was. She wasn't far from home at all. In fact, she had never left her grandmother's property. "It's too cold to stay out any longer," her grandmother said from the back porch. Emma ran up the steps and flung her arms around the old woman's waist. "Oh, your hands are ice cold. Let's get you warmed up." Emma nodded her head in agreement. The smell of baked sweets coming from the kitchen battled that of the crackling living room fire, and a war that's only victor was the small child whose nostrils were filled with the heartwarming scent of the holidays. Emma took off her jacket and changed out of her muddied clothes into a comfy set of pajamas, still hot from the dryer. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and sat down in front of the fire. Her numbed hands soon began to thaw, and the rosy pinkness of her cheeks started to fade. "Cookie?" Her grandmother offered her one of the fresh-baked goodies from a tray full of chocolate chip goodness. "Yes, please." Emma pulled her hand out from underneath the blanket and grabbed 2 cookies. "Thank you." Her grandmother smiled. "I'll get you a glass of almond milk to wash those down with." Emma happily sat there, warm and full, thinking about the adventure she had had. "I climbed a tree, leapt down into a dangerous ravine, escaped being eaten by a bear, and found my way home after wandering so far," she said, perhaps exaggerating slightly on some points. "That sounds very exciting." Her grandmother was now snuggled up beside her. "It was, Gammy, and I wasn't scared at all," Emma explained proudly. "Not at all." "Not even a little bit?" "Not even a little bit." "Wow, you are so brave." "I know." Emma laid her head against her grandmother's shoulder and smiled. You look tired. Let's go to bed. Oh, I'm not tired at all, objected Emma as she yawned. Soon she was fast asleep, dreaming about the adventures she would have the next day.